Hello and welcome to the Indiana Lawyer Podcast, your source for news in Hoosier law. Brought to you by Taft. I'm Jordan Morey, Indiana lawyer, managing editor, and your host. Thanks for joining us. The 2023 session of the Indiana General Assembly has begun, which means we have lots of news for you from the Statehouse. Our extended interview this week also comes from the Statehouse, and it's actually 2 interviews, not just one. Stick around to hear them. Of course, we have non-legislative news for you too. Let's dive into all of it. Today is Wednesday, January 25th, 2023, and these are your headlines. To start us off, here's Indiana Lawyer editor Olivia Covington to start off our Statehouse Roundup.
Thanks, Jordan. Last week, 6 Indiana counties began the process of getting legislative approval to add new judges, magistrates, or courts to their local judiciaries. State Representative Jerry Torr, a Republican from Carmel, presented those requests to the Indiana House Courts and Criminal Code Committee on January 18th. House Bill 1114 includes requests for judicial resources from Daviess, Delaware, Du Bois, Elkhart, Spencer, and Vigo counties. Daviess, Delaware, and Spencer counties are each asking for 1 additional magistrate judge, while Du Bois County is asking for a 2nd Superior Court, and Vigo County is asking for 1 additional judge. The largest request in the bill comes from Elkhart County, which wants to create 4 full-time magistrate judge positions this year, then 2 additional magistrate judge positions in 2024. Judge Gretchen Lund of the Elkhart Superior Court testified during the committee meeting that her county is in the middle of a judicial consolidation process, and the additional magistrates will help achieve the goal of administering justice more efficiently. Each of the 6 counties presented their requests last fall to the Interim Study Committee on Courts and the Judiciary, which is a required first step on the road to getting the additional resources they want. The House Courts Committee gave unanimous support to Torr's bill at the January 18th meeting, which means the bill is headed to the full House of Representatives for consideration. That hearing hasn't been scheduled at the time I'm recording this, but check back with our website for updates.
Thanks, Olivia. Staying in the State House but shifting to the courts, the Indiana Supreme Court heard oral arguments last Thursday in the constitutional challenge to the state's new abortion ban. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the State House was nearly packed with media and other spectators, with pro- and anti-abortion advocates waiting outside the courtroom doors. Back in September, a trial judge enjoined the abortion ban, finding it violated the right to privacy in Article 1, Section 1 of the Indiana Constitution. But the state is arguing that Article 1, Section 1 doesn't actually create a judicially enforceable right. On the other side, the ACLU of Indiana and Planned Parenthood are arguing that Article 1, Section 1's guarantee of the right to liberty includes a person's right to manage the most personal aspects of their lives, including deciding when and if to have a child. The Supreme Court carved out an hour for the arguments, which were presented by Indiana Solicitor General Tom Fisher and Ken Falk of the ACLU. The justices asked several questions ranging from basic procedural issues to more substantive questions about the meat of the law. One main procedural issue that came up could drive how the court rules. The law has been preliminarily enjoined, meaning it hasn't been fully litigated. Given that background, Chief Justice Loretta Rush questioned whether the court's ruling on the injunction would essentially amount to a ruling on the constitutionality of the abortion ban. Fisher said yes, claiming the trial judge essentially declared the law unconstitutional when she entered the injunction. The arguments covered several other issues as well. Check out the article on our website for all the details, or visit the Supreme Court's website to watch the arguments in full. All right, one last thing from the State House. Chief Justice Rush gave her annual State of the Judiciary address last month. I was in the Indiana House chamber during her speech. Here are some highlights. The theme of this year's address was Indiana courts as engines of economic development, fairness, and public safety. And the Chief Justice's speech focused on the work of the courts that, quote, makes Indiana an attractive state for economic development and how it can protect public safety in Indiana, end quote. Among those drivers of economic development are the commercial courts, Rush said, highlighting there are now 10 of the specialized courts statewide that have seen more than 1,600 cases since 2016. She also talked about the problem-solving courts, including the numerous veterans courts programs around the state. Rush also recapped the technological improvements made over the last year in the judiciary and said the courts are currently working on their biggest project to date with a system called InJail. InJail will be implemented in Martin, Grant, and Elkhart counties this year, allowing judges to view real-time incarceration status, alert community agencies when a supervised individual is arrested, and create a new ability to share offender information between jails, law enforcement, community corrections, and probation offices. Rush also recapped the changes in the appellate and trial courts, and specifically thanked Court of Appeals Judge Margaret Robb, who is retiring this year after 25 years. To read more about the state of the judiciary, read my story on theindianalawyer.com. Now let's shift gears to some judicial discipline news about a judge who will soon be suspended from the bench. You may remember that back in December, we reported on a judicial discipline complaint filed against Judge Jeffrey Mead of Gibson County. That case has been resolved less than 2 months later. Here's a rundown. Judge Mead was charged with 4 counts of judicial misconduct for his handling of 2 child welfare cases. The first was a paternity case, and Judge Mead was accused of making, quote, intemperate judicial comments, end quote, to the father, including using profanity from the bench and comparing the litigant's case to his own divorce proceedings. The second case involved children in need of services. In May 2020, Mead held an off-the-record hearing in that case in his chambers, but not all parties were allowed to be present, even though he made oral rulings. No transcript was ever created from the hearing, nor was there any recording. The judge in the Indiana Commission on Judicial Qualifications agreed that Mead violated several provisions of the Code of Judicial Conduct. For that misconduct, he will serve a 7-day unpaid suspension beginning January 30th. He'll be automatically reinstated at the end of the 7-day period. Mead has been the subject of 3 other disciplinary actions, resulting in 2 private cautions and 1 deferred resolution for, quote, demeanor issues and non-judicious behavior. He's been on the Gibson Circuit Court since 2007. Next, I'm going to throw it over to Alexa Shrake for a quick report about a federal lawsuit against the Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary.
On January 12th, the ACLU of Indiana filed a lawsuit against the Federal Bureau of Prisons alleging unconstitutional conditions at the Terre Haute Penitentiary, which houses the federal death row. The complaint was filed on the behalf of Georgios Katamovas, one of roughly 38 inmates on death row in Terre Haute, and alleges violations in the inmates' Eighth Amendment rights. Specifically, the complaint claims the individuals on death row are in isolated conditions in the special confinement unit that constitute cruel and unusual punishment. There are different levels of isolation according to the complaint, ranging from 1 hour of solitary recreation a day to limited interactions with one other inmate. The Bureau of Prisons hasn't yet responded to the complaint. We'll keep an eye on the docket in the Indiana Southern District Court.
To wrap up, I'll send it back to Alexa for a preview of a story she's working on for the February 1st issue of Indiana Lawyer.
Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law announced this month that it's launching a new hybrid part-time JD program in the fall 2023 semester. IU McKinney is the only law school in the state that has a part-time JD program, and now it's the only law school to offer a hybrid program. The program is very similar to the existing part-time program, but with more flexibility, according to school officials. Students in the hybrid program will come to campus twice a week for the first 2 years. Then they will have the option of taking up to 30 credit hours online. I'll dive into specifics of the hybrid program in the February 1st issue, so be sure to pick up a copy. Back to you, Jordan.
Okay, that'll do it for this week's headlines. Visit our website for more on these stories or for any other legal news. Stick around after our sponsor break to hear back-to-back interviews with the general counsel for the Indiana Senate Republican and Democratic caucuses.
Taft, today's modern law firm. At Taft, we cultivate a highly respectful, transparent workplace that fosters creativity, teamwork, inclusion, and diversity. We couple our culture with a client-first approach, rewarding lawyers who understand their clients' goals and work to deliver success. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
For this week's extended interview, we have Jeff Papa, Chief of Staff and General Counsel of the Indiana Senate Republican Caucus. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us here.
Jeff has held his current position since November 2018 and previously was an attorney with Barnes & Thornburg, practicing immigration law. Prior to that, working at Barnes, Jeff served as Chief of Staff, Chief Legal Counsel of the Senate from 2007 to 2017. Jeff has served 2 terms as chair of the Indiana chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, as well as 2 terms on the National Board of Governors of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He is heavily involved in his community, even becoming the first mayor in Zionsville history in 2015. Jeff earned his JD from the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, as well as an LLM law degree concentrated in intellectual property law. In addition, Jeff holds a bachelor's degree from Rose-Hulman, a master's from Ball State, and a PhD in education leadership and administration from Indiana State University. Okay, so to begin, Jeff, when I checked on your LinkedIn profile, your resume is quite diverse. Could you just kind of tell us your career arc and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. As I was finishing up my time at Rose-Hulman, I sort of ran into an advertisement for the Senate internship program and sort of accidentally ended up participating in it. I think I was an alternate, last minute grab, but it worked out really well. And so I came as an intern, served in the Senate for that session of 1993, and then went back to Russia for the summer, spent the next year and a half at Ball State getting the master's degree, and then the Senate hired me as a legislative assistant coming out of that master's degree. And then, as you noted, I've been either there or at Barnes and Thornburg pretty much since that time.
So what does it mean to be the chief of staff and general counsel of the Indiana Senate Republican Caucus?
Well, the way we're structured, we have two, I'm not politically partisan, but partisan staffs developed to serve the two major caucuses in the Senate. So we have a Republican caucus and a Democrat caucus, which means that the Republican side has to service the Republican members, the Democrat staff has to serve the Democrat members, but whichever caucus has a majority has to control, make the trains run on time and control the processes and the budgets and external matters and so on. And so because we've had the majority for quite a while, that goes through us to make even the nonpartisan stuff work, the IT staff, the duplicating and bill distribution and the doorkeepers, all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So we work well with the Democrat staff as well, but they ultimately have to make their requests through us for anything budget-wise or hiring, firing, external contracts, anything like that. So, it's a little bit of everything. And so the chief of staff role, ultimately all the personnel report up through me on the staff side, and all the budgeting, the procedure, the process. And then in the general counsel role, we have all the litigation. The legislation, that's obvious. And I think the public pretty much understands that's what the General Assembly does. But there's also a lot of process stuff that happens. There's a lot of research that happens. And people may not be very well aware of it or think about it too much, but probably the majority of the work that's done is constituent assistance. It's not lawmaking. So there's a lot of legal research. There's a lot of practical research. There's a lot of sorting stuff out. Well, is this a federal matter? Is it a state matter? Is it a state agency? And whatever the person or group is having a problem with, can we work that out just by making a call or just finding the answer for them? Or is it something where a senator is going to have to actually weigh in or propose legislation? Or is it something less formal? But all of that research. So we have our own small legal department.
Oh, interesting.
That handles the legal components of that kind of research in drafting certain amendments, certain resolutions. But then outside of that, Legislative Services Agency does the bulk of that work, and they do a really great job. But we do some of it, and that's where my general counsel role comes into play, is the part that we do on the legal side, just a small piece. And then in my chief of staff role, everything else falls under that.
Sure.
So what does your schedule look like right now during session, and how does it maybe differ compared to, a shorter session?
Yeah, it's not much different in terms of a long session versus a short session in terms of what happens every day. I think a long session may take a little bit longer to ramp up to 110% speed, but really there's not much difference these days in terms of the day-to-day between a long and short session. And it's not a predictable thing. And you can't have a calendar schedule that says, I know where I'm going to be at 2 p.m. I mean, you obviously calendar stuff all day long, but it changes minute by minute. And there's not really crises, but very urgent things bubble up continuously throughout the day. So you have to be very good at allocating your time and delegating and finding what the priority is at the moment and still addressing everything.
Sure.
But it's constantly different every day.
Can you a time you can share that has really stood out during your career where you had to respond, immediately?
Well, obviously, from time to time, we have security threats. I mean, someone's having a heated argument or making a threat, or there's just maybe something going on in the hallway that's spilling over or something that someone could get hurt. And even without intent, I mean, we have people get injured. And so those things obviously have to take the top priority. But in terms of from moment to moment, it could be anything. I mean, it could be maybe a critical question came up in a committee about, well, can we do this or can't, or how does this need to move forward, or on the floor during session. And that's not something you can put off till tomorrow. I mean, you need an answer right now, and everybody's waiting to see, hey, what is the answer? And because of the nature of the process, you know, you're going to have people who disagree, and you're going to have the two caucuses possibly disagree, or maybe it's not even along caucus lines. Maybe it's some other line, but you know, people that have strong feelings on what the right answer is, or multiple feelings on what the right answer is, but somebody's got to make a decision, and it's almost immediate, which is a little strange in the legal context. I mean, I understand the pressure of courtroom, and that I don't really want to do that.
Sure.
But you know, it is something where you're making a judgment based on the Constitution, state law, the federal Constitution, the rules, the Senate rules, the joint rules, and you need to be right. So it's there's some pressure to that, trying to make sure that you're ready for those, and the other people are ready for those.
I think, Jordan, I'm going to maybe reword our next question a little bit, because, you know, you've done public law, like in this, not necessarily public law, but, you know, this chief counsel role, you've done private practice with Barnes, you know, you've just kind of, your career, like Jordan said, has been very diverse. So I guess I'm just interested, you know, how did you come to the law, and then how did you kind of decide what you wanted to do with your law degree?
Yeah, well, I never wanted to be a lawyer. Actually, I had a roommate who worked at the Senate a long time ago, and he was a first-year law student, and he kept telling me, "Oh no, you really need to take the LSAT. You really take the LSAT." I said, "I don't really want to take the LSAT." And finally, I just took it mainly so he'd stop asking me about it, and I did pretty well on that. And the Senate had some tuition reimbursement procedures at the time, so I went to IU Indianapolis, now McKinney, in the evening while I was working at the Senate in various roles, and so got my law degree finished. Never really intended to practice, but I'd always said, you know, in law school, people always say, "What kind of law do you want to do? What kind of law do you want to do?" I said, well, if I was ever to practice law, I'd want to do immigration law. And people would laugh and say, "There's no immigration law in Indiana." Well, actually, it's not true.
Not at
all. And it wasn't true back then either. Most people didn't understand that, but there was. And then I really lucked into a role at Barnes & Thornburg as an associate. It was after I'd taken the bar and passed the bar, and they had need for someone to help their immigration department. And really, I was just extremely lucky. And they gave me a chance, and that was a really wonderful experience. So I left the Senate and went to Barnes for about 7 years doing immigration law. Then went back to the Senate as chief of staff. And as you mentioned, spent about 9.5 years there. Went back to Barnes & Thornburg, spent about 14 months. And then there was a leadership change in the Senate, and they asked me to come back, mainly, I think, for some institutional knowledge, because we did a new leadership team. And so just to come back very temporarily, and I think that was a little over 4 years ago now. So, yeah, still there.
So you obviously worked with lots and lots of people. Do you think there should be more lawyer legislators, you know, at the State House, and how does that dynamic kind of change operations when you are dealing with other attorneys?
Yeah, well, you know, historically there were many more attorneys, and there are fewer and fewer these days. I don't think it's a requirement or a core necessity to be, but I do think it's extremely important to have a number of them who are lawyer legislators, because I think you need some members with that perspective of, okay, here's the practical effect of changing this law. And you know, as all your listeners know, you just have a different view of what the practical. You're not just looking at the practical effect. You also have to think about, well, how does the Constitution come into play? You know, there's some history here. How does the code itself work? And Legislative Services Agency is fantastic at bridging that gap. So it's not necessary to be a lawyer, but I think the perspective, and particularly with certain, let's say, committees, like, for example, Judiciary Committee, or, you know, courts issues or criminal law, it's really a good thing to have some practical knowledge on the committee. Doesn't have to be all the members, but maybe some who grasp that intuitively about what the effects would be. Mm-hmm. So I think there's enough there now. I don't know. It's not up to me to say more or less is better, but I think it's fine and it works really well. I'm not sure it would be great if there were 0 or just 2 or 3 total, and it probably would not be good if there were 150 of us either. Well, not us. I'm not a member, but you know what I mean. Lawyers serving the General Assembly. Yeah, because you need other perspectives too.
Right. All right. Shifting gears a little bit. Let's talk about Yeti.
Sure.
Nonprofit that raises funds to sustain an orphanage in Nepal. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. So tell us how that started, what your, role is, why you're passionate about this. Give us the scoop.
Well, starting in college and after, I spent 5 summers in the former Soviet Union.
Wow.
And then I did 3 study abroads during the summers through law school. But shortly after that, I went to Nepal and taught English in a village for not quite a month. It was a little less than 3.5 weeks, maybe, where I was the only person who spoke English, and I was supposed to be teaching the kids how to, some English and doing some nonprofit stuff there. Well, the group that I found on the internet to have that experience, it's common now, but they were really on the front edge of this volunteerism. Mm-hmm. And so I paid them some amount, and I cannot remember. It was either $350 or $500 for that almost month, which was everything from getting picked up at the airport through getting taken back to the airport at the end of it. All the meals, everything, living in the village. And they made a profit off that. Mm-hmm. And then they used that for small community development things. Like they bought some polio vaccinations. They were growing anti-erosion plants. They were maybe putting little cement stairs in the hill for some of the older residents of villages. Just little stuff here and there. And so we had that experience. I spent that time there. And I remember very specifically when I got on the plane to come back thinking, well, I'll never be back to Nepal again. And I think that was 16 trips to Nepal ago or so.
Wow.
But that was in 2000, and sometime in 2003, Steve Wolf, who's an attorney here in town, he and I were planting some trees, and we got to talking about it. I thought, well, maybe I wonder if they'd be interested in the group I worked with in Nepal, which I hadn't talked to for almost 3 years. I said, I wonder if they'd be interested in starting an orphanage. And Steve Wolf and I sent him an email, and we didn't hear back for about a week and a half, and thought, well, either the email's dead or they don't care about this idea or they're gone. But 10 or 11 days later, we got an email back with about a dozen PDFs attached to it. And in that week and a half, this is in the middle of a horrible 10-year civil war.
Oh my goodness.
In that week and a half, they had visited 4 existing orphanages to study them. They had talked to the government about what was required. They'd gotten somebody's father to say they would donate the land if the project went through. They had an unemployed architect friend do renderings of a 3-phase building project. They had unemployed construction workers, like low-skilled construction workers, say, "Hey, if you feed us and give us a little bit, we'll put this together." Mm-hmm. And they built a draft budget, and so at that point we really didn't have a choice. The project was on, and so we raised the funds to build the building in 3 phases, and then there was a 4th later to build a cafeteria-style building. We raised the money for that, and then we pay to operate it each year. And our big fundraiser is the annual dinner. It's March 6th this year is the fundraiser. It's a dinner and an auction. And then as we raise those funds, we guaranteed the IRS that we would spend at least 10 to 15% here at home on underprivileged kids as well. So we've tried to stick to that over the years as well, at least that much spent here.
Sure.
Becoming the mayor of Zionsville, tell us about how that kind of unfolded and why you've stayed also engaged in local politics.
Yeah, well, I was on the Zionsville Town Council, and as you know, towns in Indiana, with the exception of Vernon, Indiana, I think, do not have a mayor. They just have a town council. And that's great when you're really small, but when you start to think about the conflicts that develop, your executive branch in a town is the president of the town council. So the leader of the legislative branch is also, by his or herself, the executive branch. And it sets up a lot of inherent conflicts with staying true to the open door law, trying to negotiate with possible business partners, just all kinds of things. And the staff of the town being on edge about which faction would like them to no longer work there or not. And I think it works well in smaller towns, but once you grow to a certain size, that becomes a little unworkable, especially when most of your counselors have full-time jobs. They're not just concentrating on that. And so we struggled with a lot of that, and Zionsville was growing rapidly. We did it. We used the Government Modernization Act before that once, and we got rid of I was on a township board. We proposed it with the town of Zionsville and another township. We got rid of the two townships, merged them into the town. It was the first time it had ever been done, and we did a lot of unique things in there, but we still kept the town structure. And so as we grew rapidly, that became less and less workable. So then when a third township was interested in merging with us, we used the Government Modernization Act a second time. I think it's only been used 4 times in state history. Maybe there are more now, but in Zionsville done it twice. The second time we proposed to get rid of the clerk treasurer, but instead have an elected mayor who would take all the executive branch powers from the council president. And then you would have a town with a mayor. Well, we made several other changes too, but we just felt that was important. We didn't want to lose our identity as a town, but we wanted to have a full-time executive who was dedicated to running the town and making sure things were on track.
Sure.
So that had to go before the voters, and we also got sued and went all the way to the state Supreme Court.
Wow.
And, worked out. They affirmed what we did, and it's moved forward. We've had some growing pains in the last few years there, but I think it's all getting worked out.
Is there anything from that experience that you found transferable to your role now?
Oh, well, yes, and vice versa. I wouldn't.
Sure.
The second reorg, the first reorg was very collaborative and organic things developed. The second one, I wrote myself. The law changed in how it worked. The first time you passed it, and then you came up with the plan over a year. The second time, state law had changed to say that you develop the plan and then you present that to the two governing bodies and to the voters. And so that plan for the second one, I wrote, and there's no way I would have been able to do that without an experience with the state legislature and having seen all of the interactions with the code that local governments were having, and then the experience on the town council, seeing that too, to be able to make those adjustments and to say, hey, here's our own constitution that we've come up with ourselves. That's not where you're allowed to exempt yourself from certain state statutes and rewrite the whole thing. Yeah. And you really have to have a good grasp, like try to think through all of the possibilities, because you're making something that you can't back out of easily without another reorg or a change in state law or something like that.
Sure.
What is something lawyers should know about you or maybe the Indiana Senate Republican caucus?
I don't know in what context is that. We're approachable. If people have questions, not just lobbyists or law firms, but the general public, if there are questions about things, we're always happy to try to address those. And when attorneys have questions or lobbyists have questions about what about this, is this germane, those things, we answer those in a neutral basis and say, whether we have an opinion on the matter itself or not, we'll say, yes, you could do that procedurally. Or no, you can't do that procedurally, but maybe think about this. So I think we provide some resource there. And again, I want to give a plug for Legislative Services Agency too, and the fantastic work they do. They have a big team of attorneys and fiscal analysts that do all the hard attorney work for the legislature.
Sure.
In terms of drafting bills and drafting big amendments and doing research.
How much crossover is there with the House and also with the Senate Democrats? I mean, is there any, what's that kind of like? Yeah,
well, we work with the House all the time. There's a lot of, not coordination of outcome, but discussions of things that are happening and going back and forth. And of course, a lot of communication with the governor's office. And we do communicate quite well with the Senate Democrats. And I think you're talking to their chief counsel at another time, and he's fantastic. We have a great relationship with him, and nothing ever gets personal. And the debates are back and forth. People have an image of Washington D.C. and people fighting all the time, and it's really not like that here. The media may try to sensationalize the fights, but it's really 3 or 4 or 5 big things a year that get in those big discussions. But you'd be amazed if you saw the statistics of how many bills every session pass with bipartisan support. I think it's a majority pass with at least one member of both parties voting in favor on final passage. A vast majority. And then even the number that pass unanimously is huge. I mean, it's almost unbelievable until you look at the numbers, and it's consistent every year. But by the time it gets to the final debate, most bills have broad and general agreement between the parties. And we have our disagreements, but I think it's a great working relationship, and both caucuses have great leaders that are good working with each other, and I think it's a good situation right now.
For sure. Thanks again to Chief of Staff and General Counsel of the Indiana Senate Republican Caucus, Jeff Papa, for joining us. For part 2 of this week's Senate interview, we have Jordan Cedar, Chief Legal Counsel and Deputy Chief of Staff for the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jordan has served as counsel for the Senate Democratic Caucus since 2013 after spending just under a year as a staff attorney at Barnes & Thornburg. He's a 2006 Indiana University graduate and 2009 graduate of the Washington University School of Law. To begin, Jordan, was it always your plan to get involved in politics, and what was kind of your journey, to your current position?
Yeah, I don't know if it was always my plan. I've always been interested in Democratic politics. When I was in law school, I did some volunteering during Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. And then when I moved to Indianapolis following law school, I got a little bit more involved in local politics, which led to me getting a position as a part-time attorney at the Indiana Senate beginning in the 2011 session.
Mm-hmm. Are you from Indiana? Why did you decide to go to the University of Washington?
So I'm from Ohio originally, but I went to IU for undergrad. And I went to Washington University in St. Louis. My sister went to graduate school there, and I visited the campus and really liked it. And it's an excellent school. So I got in and ended up going there.
So what does a day look like for you right now in the middle of session?
Sure. So we're just now getting ramped up with session. We kind of got a little bit of a late start. But now that committees are starting to meet in earnest and bills are starting to move along the process, my day consists of following along with those committees, reading through all the bills that are being considered, working with our Democratic senators if they have any questions about bills that are being heard or any ideas for amendments as it goes through the process for second reading and then final passage before they move to the House. So it kind of varies depending on what committees are meeting and how much is on the docket for a given day.
Is there much difference between a short and a long session other than just the length of time you're meeting?
Sure. The biggest difference is obviously the budget bill that's heard during the long session, and that kind of dominates oftentimes the discussion during a long session. So, but that being said, just having more time to hear bills means that a lot of other issues can also arise, and I'm sure that's going to be the case for the session as well.
What about when you're not in session? What's a day like then?
It's definitely less busy. We do have interim study committees that meet beginning in the fall, typically sometimes a little bit earlier than that. So I work with those and also getting bill research and working for ideas for the subsequent session begins pretty much as soon as session is over. Mm-hmm. The last two interims we've had, an extended session for redistricting, and then this past year with the special session for mostly SB1 has sort of cut into that interim time, but it gives an opportunity to plan for the harder work of session.
Sure.
What's your relationship like with the House? Do you often work together with them as well as and then the Republican Senate? What was that relationship like?
Yeah, definitely work with both those groups. For the House, we work with the House Democratic staff typically at the halfway point of session when all the Senate bills have moved to the House and vice versa. We'll meet with the House staff to kind of discuss what moved, what kind of issues they flagged or spotted as those bills move through their House and now are going to be heard in ours. And then with the Senate Republican staff, we definitely work very closely with them, have a very cordial relationship, and a lot of times there are things we're working collaboratively with.
Talk about some maybe unique challenges of your job and, we could talk about that generally, but I am curious, being the minority caucus, if there's any sort of unique challenges that come with that.
Yeah, I think that there can be challenges and frustrations being such a small minority compared to the majority caucus, as far as feeling like we have an opportunity to get our priorities heard and being able to, advocate for our constituents. Because there are members from both parties on all the committees, we do have, it keeps our members busier than they might otherwise be, since they have to serve on more committees to fill out a lot of those roles. And it does give us opportunity to, offer amendments and offer perspectives on everything that is heard that goes through the Senate. So it can be frustrating, but it's also rewarding when you feel like there's impact being made.
Sure.
How do you feel like your law degree has, helped you with your professional life?
So I kind of have a unique role for an attorney. I'm counsel representing a legislative caucus, which is not a very common position, but I do think that it involves a lot of research and analysis, which is the skills I definitely picked up in law school and throughout my legal education. So, I don't think I could do my job without being an attorney. Yeah, I think legal research, writing has, being able to quickly synthesize new information that we get, because a lot of times, especially during session, we don't have a lot of lead time to, we receive amendments the day of session. So our office has to work pretty quickly to go through bills that obviously cover, the entire spectrum of issues that the legislature covers, which is, pretty much everything: criminal law, local government, environmental law, natural resources, utilities, all the issues that we face.
So there's a fair share of lawyer legislators in both houses. Minority Leader Taylor is an attorney, for example. What's the benefit of that? And do you think, we need more lawyers serving as our lawmakers? I'm not going to ask the communication staff who's in here with me if that is the case. I think it's definitely beneficial for legislators to have a legal background, especially on criminal justice and judiciary committees where they deal with issues facing the courts and criminal penalties. I also think it's good to have lay members or non-legal members who can bring a different perspective for issues that they hear. But our caucus has often had a lot of attorneys. We've had two longstanding members, Senator Talley and Senator Landon, who were both attorney members and have recently left, which is a big loss to have that sort of institutional knowledge. But we still have, I believe, 3 attorneys in our caucus now. And it's definitely useful both for the issues and also for the sometimes procedural questions that are raised on the floor. It's good to have attorneys to handle those. Sure.
What is something lawyers should know about either you and maybe the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus?
That one always gets people.
Yeah.
I think that I will say, I'll answer for the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus. I do think that our members are the attorney members and the non-attorney members both are, very cognizant of the responsibility of being a legislator and how much, the bills that we pass can affect people's everyday life. And I think that's something that they and I as well take into account when we're considering bills that go through the process.
So you've been in this job coming up on 10 years, I guess. I mean, What do you enjoy about it that keeps you there that long?
There's a lot of variety in the issues that we see. So a lot of attorneys focus on a specific practice area, whether it be criminal law, family law, and I basically have to know a little bit about everything, which I enjoy, being able to learn about new issues. And also I've been here long enough to, feel comfortable with our members that I can bring some assistance or to help through.
Yeah.
As Deputy Chief of Staff, you kind of mentioned you have to think quickly on your feet when things happen. Are there any instances that you can recall over the past 9-ish years where you were put in a really interesting situation with a set of circumstances that came up?
I guess I think back to the 2018 session when on the last day of session, there was a lot of back and forth on, this was the final day, it was the day of sine die, and back and forth on dealing with some of the last bills. And there was a discussion about moving the session or going past the midnight deadline and whether that would be something that we could consider. And at the time, Senator Lannon was the minority leader, and kind of having discussions with him right before we were a little bit of a scramble mode trying to figure out what the situation was. And it ended up being we did adjourn at midnight per Indiana code, which was required, and ended up having to go to a special session. But that was one of the situations where it was a very quick sort of timeline to figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
You're also kind of in a unique position with COVID, obviously, and trying to scramble. What do you kind of remember about those initial stages and just trying to figure out how to make this all work?
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate in some way that the COVID restrictions, the COVID pandemic in general, was right at the tail end of our 2020 session. It was a short session, so we were wrapping up in March. And so for the worst of the pandemic, we were not in session, so it was a lot easier to adjust and work from home. And then, I think our technology teams and the folks from LSA did a good job, like a fantastic job of getting us prepared for the 2021 session, which was still under COVID conditions. And I believe when we started, we were still on half staff in the office at a time, which was difficult to do while still actually being in session. But, I think that everyone did a good job of kind of being flexible and getting us through that 2021 session.
That'll do it for this week's episode. Thanks to Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel of the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus, Jordan Cedar, for joining us. To catch up on previous episodes of the Indiana Lawyer Podcast, visit theindianalawyer.com or visit your favorite streaming service.